Straight to the panel. Renee Valaris, National Political Editor for the Courier Mail in Queensland, and Bruce Hawker, who helped to run Labor campaigns federally and state, now head of the Campaigns and Communications Group. Bruce, extraordinary scenes in Sydney today with police forcing people to get off the parks, get off the grass, go home or else jail or a fine. Now, I agree, Bruce, social isolation policies have been necessary up to now, and some need to continue, but it's extraordinary how far the new ones go and how little debate there's been about this. I mean, we're told this is how we're supposed to live for months.
And Andrew, if you did a poll right now of the Australian population, they would say more strength to the arm of the government and the police. And I think that's entirely as it should be. I think this is a time to speak softly and carry a stick, because in the past, and we've seen this as a very slow start, I think, by the government in these rules. They went around telling people they shouldn't do things, and then they were just ignored. And we can't have that. We've got to have a situation where people are actually following the directions of the police and the government, and this national cabinet's been established by Scott Morrison. If we don't do that, we're in all sorts of trouble. And I've got no concerns about giving away some civil liberties right now for the sake of saving lives.
It's not just now, it's for 6 months. Renee, what might be appropriate for breaking up big gatherings in an urban place like Sydney, you know, the more densely populated bits where there has been a lot of disease, may not be appropriate in countries in the countryside where they've had none?
Yeah, and that's right, Andrew. I mean, and also, you know, I'm not a doctor. I'm happy to interpret the political, goings and comings, but obviously not a doctor. But the point is, Queensland is very decentralised. What is happening in pockets of southeast Queensland is not happening in cases of some parts of rural and remote Queensland. So you're shutting down entire economies, local economies, when they don't even have one case of coronavirus. So at some point, I think a one-size-fits-all approach that the government has rolled out across Australia is probably going to have to be wound back at some point. However, I will say this. I mean, the Chief Health Officer, Brendan Murphy, has been very, very measured in his responses. I mean, he has been extremely good. The government didn't push the panic button straight away, like so many had argued that they do. We'd be in a different situation now, I think. We'd have more unemployed people, we'd have more misery, you know, in homes. So I think it's important to recognise, while Professor Murphy was the first to call it a pandemic, way ahead of the World Health Organisation, by the way, and he deserves credit for that. But at the same time, while the good communities, the ones who are following the advice, while there is no cases in those communities and there is advice that you don't go to those communities because, you know, there's non-essential travel, then those restrictions should be eased for those communities with no cases.
But Andrew, the problem
go ahead, Bruce.
But before we had one case in Australia, there were all these cases in China. Someone came to Australia and brought it here. People travel. And that's why we have to have strong quarantine rules in place, not just
our borders are locked
with
down
our
now.
overseas borders, but also in places like Cloncurry or Dubbo in New South Wales, where we now have cases, or Bathurst, where we now have cases. It's not just the city areas that are getting these exposed to coronavirus. It's rural communities as well. And I think it's improper to be suggesting that these communities can be immune to it. They're not. And if they get it in their communities or remote Aboriginal communities get it, what happens then?
Yeah.
You know, you get communities wiped out. That's a terrible thing to be suggesting.
No, but we're not suggesting that you do it today. No one's suggesting you do it today. I mean,
yes, you were. You were saying why should these people have to be have their civil liberties in some way restricted? Well, I'm sorry. We do, as a nation, have to be concerned about this. It's a very, very serious problem.
Bruce, no one's doubting it's a serious problem. No one's doubting there's a danger. No one's doubting that this virus is deadly. It comes to a question of risk management. For example, the flu every year kills a lot of people, and we don't shut everything down. Doesn't it make sense that in some places where that are remote, where you do not get many visitors, and where you do still maintain some care, you know, washing hands, all that kind of stuff, that it seems really crazy that you can't invite two people into your home, for instance.
Well, Andrew, I think what we're going to see is a sensible application of the law. The police are going to be much more likely to be looking at what's happening on South Bank in Brisbane or on Bondi Beach in Sydney rather than what's happening in Cloncurry. They might even move some police from those remote areas down to the cities to make sure that they've got the resources to deal with the problem where it's at its most extreme. But I know people in remote Aboriginal communities who are very, very happy now that they've been isolated from this coronavirus by restricting to absolutely zero the number of people that can come into their communities. Because if it does get into, say, Aboriginal communities, you will see whole SWAT families wiped out, and that is a terrible
Bruce,
thing.
that's their choice, and they're welcome to it, and good on them. But the point
it's the government's choice,
those communities,
and we elected the government.
Those communities are largely dependent on welfare. Other communities are dependent on work, and this may be different. They may make a different choice. But Renee,
we're all dependent on welfare now, Andrew, thanks to the good socialist government in Canberra.
Well, there's Renee, do you think there's any debate now in Cabinet that maybe over the next couple of weeks, as have been arguing, that if we toughen the restrictions on people who are potentially infectious, and we do far more to isolate and support the old and the sick, that perhaps we can wind back some of the draconian restrictions on everyone else?
Yes, I think, and just to go back to my point, I wasn't suggesting that we open everything up today. That is not what I'm suggesting. And the other point I'd like to make that I think is important, Bruce, is that at the moment you're not supposed to be moving outside your suburbs if you don't have to. So you're not going.
Exactly.
You're not supposed to be. You're not supposed to be a great nomad going up to
People do go. There might be people that have to go there to provide valuable sources of resources to those communities who go in there and bring the disease in. It can happen.
Yeah,
and don't pretend it can't.
Renee?
Yeah.
Go on.
So what I'm trying to say is that at some point when the curve starts to flatten, and that probably will be, well, hang on a minute. I mean, how long do you want to lock the economy down for? I mean, this is just an absolute ridiculous argument where too many people want to push the panic button and scare everyone.
That's not what you were saying 5 minutes ago.
No, what I was saying 5 minutes ago, Bruce, is that at some point we're going to have to lift some restrictions for some areas, and I think at the same point, probably in Bondi and others, you'll probably have to put more of a thumb on them. So basically, you can't run a one-size-fits-all kind of restrictions on Australia. We're too decentralised. We've got too many communities outside cities for that to happen, and at some point there are going to need to be people who need to go back into the
Well, you're only starting to talk about at some point now. You weren't talking about that a few minutes ago, so don't pretend you were.
Well, Bruce, no need for the aggression, but Bruce...
Andrew, we're talking on the Bolt report.
But don't you accept... I like a civilised, polite discussion, but Bruce, don't you accept that it's not a question of, totally death on one side and nirvana and safety on the other, that both approaches, the broad brush approach that you favour for a long period of time, is going to cost lives and mental health and a lot of distress as well. It's not like it's painless.
Well, Andrew, I'm not saying that this necessarily has to go for a long time. I say if you do go in hard and you go in early, then you've got a better chance of flattening that curve. If, as Boris Johnson was looking to do early in the piece, and suggest the sort of thing you were discussing before, where you just could try to confine the elderly and let the thing happen in the broader community, which was the sort of advice that he was getting from his chief medical advisor, the so-called herd effect, then what would we see then? We saw them lose the advantage of being able to go into a lockdown earlier, and now the UK has appalling levels of death and infection as a result of the coronavirus. We have to listen to our
I supported the early lockdown, but once you've bought that time, that gives you the opportunity to perhaps consider less brutal ways to control it. Britain
down the line
prepared for it. That's all I'm saying. Renee, going back to my point, my question: is there much debate? Do you know? And if so, where are the fault lines on that within the cabinet?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of issues. I think that Scott Morrison wants to contain the measures where they are, whereas I think the New South Wales Premier probably wants to go a bit further because she has the highest concentration of cases in her state. So for her, she's really looking at, you know, through a health prism, whereas when you start putting one in front of the other, so the economics in front of the health and health in front of the economics, that's where you get into trouble. I think you've got to walk that fine line and you've got to ensure that that you don't put one behind the other, because when you do, the other suffers, and there's very big consequences because of that. And I don't like quoting Donald Trump, for example, but I do agree with him on this issue that the cure could be worse than the actual disease. So we have to be very careful that, you know, in 6 months' time or a year's time, and when we've got enough herd immunity or there's a vaccine, there is going to there is going to be significant, you know, issues that continue to follow on from this. There'll be mental health, there'll be domestic violence, there'll be child sex abuse. There is a massive issue about keeping people at home and not getting them back in the workforce.
Renee Villaris and Bruce Hawker, thank you so much for a spirited debate, because these issues do need debate. I thank you both for your time.
Thank you.